Welcome to On the Bubble Podcast, episode 86. I'm your host, Basa J. Wada, and with me is my co-host, Yuki Lee Bender. Today, we're going to be doing our How to Draft Verdance episode. But before we get into that, congrats on your 6-0 at the ProQuest last week. How did that go for you?
Yeah, so I played Florian, which is a deck that I've been working on. I've kind of been working on a whole bunch of different decks and bouncing around, to be honest, but Florian is probably the one I've spent the most time on. And yeah, I ended up bringing sort of like a very blocky, almost Guardian style Florian deck that can pivot into a more aggressive game plan to a PQ Plus in Houston. I went 6-0 in Swiss with it. The deck felt very, very good. Kind of did exactly what I expected it to. And then I had a very interesting top 8 game that was actually on coverage. The stream was called Blood on the Bayou. We can probably have a link to it in the description. But it was a top 8 game versus a Verdance. I had never played the matchup, which was a little unfortunate. I think had I played the matchup before, I maybe could have gotten there. But it's like very interesting because the Verdance was doing a lot of arcane, denying me graveyard fill for my decompose, and I made a few mistakes during that match. And I end up also misremembering the pitch stack and going for like a very big. I go for like a germinate to try and gain some life, and then hopefully close the door because we're like both low, and there's like some weird reaping blade shenanigans. And they have the 3 blues and the scour. I was thinking that the scour was like a couple cards deeper because like I knew that there was 2 scours in the deck. I saw one just pitched, and I was like, I'm pretty sure the next scour is like a few cards deeper, and I have a window to germinate and then hit them before they draw their second scour or their like third scour, depending on your perspective. And I was wrong. So I ended up losing that game, but it's a very, very interesting one. And I think that Florian is like honestly really impressive. I think that he's going to be a real contender this format. He perhaps has some weaknesses, but I think he also has a lot of room to adapt and change plans. And I think this hero has like a ton of potential. He can outvalue KO, which was something that kind of shocked me. So yeah, Florian very sweet. If you're interested in that deck, you can check it out on Patreon. There's deck tech, deck list plus sideboard guide, um, and stuff like that. Tips and tricks videos over on the Patreon for Titanium Bauble and Up patrons. So if you want to check that out, you can do that on Patreon. And I guess right now I'll also shout out our patrons. The Discord's really been popping off. Lots of people discussing CC. Some people discussing draft as well. I suspect that as we move into PQ season, there will be a good amount of discussion of both of those. But yeah, the Patreon Discord has really been popping off, and we really appreciate everybody who's been giving back to the show and been interested in the content. It really helps us do what we do and continue putting content out there. So thank you so much. The support has been really, really incredible, especially after I think people were like a little burnt out from End Apart the Mistveil, no events coming around, and then now it's a very exciting time with a new set, PQ season, Worlds around the corner. Feels like people are excited about Flesh and Blood again, and I know I've been feeling the same way myself.
Are you planning on playing Florian again for the PQ season, or do you have a different deck brewed up now?
I'm not sure. Florian's definitely on my short list of decks. I think Enigma is a good choice right now. I think that Aurora is a really interesting choice. I think that KO is a solid but perhaps unexciting choice. So yeah, Florian's on the list of decks I could play, but I haven't completely locked in a deck for PQs. I also think New is still just like honestly really solid, like one of the better decks at the moment.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. It's gonna be good when they play blues, and when they don't play blues, I feel like she's gonna be, oof, uphill battle.
Yeah, that's like one question I have about Aurora is like how good that matchup's gonna be because Aurora, like at least like in theory, Aurora has like a lot of the Aurora decks are playing like 9 blues, so like you definitely can't play Siren Skull into that matchup if Aurora decks are still constructed the way they are. They have like the Flicker Wisp combo, which does a lot of 2 arcanes that are like really annoying to block, and they potentially have the thing where like their cards are just like a lot of their cards are just worth 4 and you just like rip a card, and if you like rip 2 cards from them and then they're just like 4 4 4, you're not very happy. Not to say like that's exactly how the matchup plays out. I think it's like more going on that. I think Aurora can be disrupted, but it's like a matchup that I'm not certain is good for new. It's kind of still exploring it. I'm yeah, I haven't made up my mind about that matchup, but Aurora maybe has some pretty good game into that deck.
That's fair. That's fair. Aurora seems to be the best aggro deck. Do you think right now?
Probably either her or Dash IO. I think for early PQ season, it's going to be Aurora for sure. It'll be more interesting when Dash gets the Armory deck. I believe it's week 3 of PQ season. I think that at that point, it's either Dash IO or Aurora. But yeah, those two decks seem like the best two aggro decks, like kind of by a lot. I don't think anything is particularly close to them. And then, Florian, Enigma seem good. Maybe if people figure out Verdance, but at the moment, I don't think she's there. I think New seems very good. And then I think there's a bunch of like solid decks after that. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think the meta looks pretty sweet, and I could see it adapting a lot. The other thing I'm curious about is I've heard a lot of people talking about Count Your Blessings decks, and honestly, I haven't tested that much into it. I do think that it always seems very good into certain types of strategies, though. Like I'm just imagining like Pistol Dash with Count Your Blessings as like KO, where like that matchup was like already super tight, and you had to like play your cast bones and do your blood rushes, and like you would like just get there. But if they're just like sitting there gaining like 5, 6, 7 life, you're just I don't know. It sounds tough.
It happens to be that we have about 15 cards in the deck that was just blue 3 blocks and nothing else. And it's a really easy switch to 9 copies of Count Your Blessings.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then Dash also gets to recapture some of the like so one of the things about Count Your Blessings is if you average it all out, assuming that you cast all 9, they end up being worth 6 per card or 3 per 2 cards because you like pitch a card to play it. So you end up getting like 3 out of those 2 cards is how it averages out, which is like okay, but not exciting. It's like pretty good considering it's life gain, but I think that when you add in Dash getting to like get a pistol counter every time, you end up being like over 3, and that's potentially like just enough to make the card like pretty solid. Like I think that's kind of the key with that card is if you're just like pitching a whole card and you don't get any value out of it, it's kind of so-so. But if you can make use of that extra resource, then I think it's actually pretty good.
Yeah, there's also another card that's really cool with it is on defense. You can pitch a blue, play Count Your Blessing, count Oasis in response, gaining a life as well before you gain the life from Count Your Blessings. So then you can use the resource that way.
Yeah, yeah. You can potentially use it with something like Brother in Arms as well. And I've also heard some people talking about rally the rear guard as a potential way, like early on, maybe you can like discard a blue count your blessings rather than playing it kind of a thing and get a 5 block. And that's like also pretty reasonable.
Yeah, the Rally or Rear Guards is I think that card's a little bit not good enough. It's
Yeah.
man, that card is so mediocre.
Yeah, yeah. Like I heard people talking about it. I'm like, maybe I see the vision, but I also feel like there's going to be some spots where you draw it and you're going to be like, no, why do I have this blue 2 block that doesn't do anything in my hand?
Yeah, I would stay away from Rally if you can. Just at that point I'd rather just play the Count Your Blessings, even though it's like slightly less value, but drawing your Rally later in the game could be even worse, and you're gonna get there because you're a Count Your Blessings deck. You're gonna get to your bitch deck.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So yeah, count your blessings is interesting. I'm curious to see how that develops. I do think there's like a lot of hate that people can bring in for that card too. Like potentially like gravekeepings are interesting against that card. Some heroes can play Talisman of Cremation, which is kind of interesting. Like Vincent or Levia or Zen, who play cards from Banish, can potentially play that. You call to count your blessings out of your graveyard, and that timed at the right moment could be a huge swing. Poison the Well, another obvious one, especially in the late game. If you can, they count your blessings, gain 7, and you're like actually lose 7, that's a 14-point swing off of one card, which is kind of insane. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and the strategy is not foolproof. It's definitely weak to a lot of cards, and like yeah, one poison the well will kill that deck. So like just bringing one in and then just having it in your arsenal or somewhere means that your opponent can't play Count Your Blessings late in the game, which makes the whole value proposition of that card just fall apart.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you can't play your last count your blessings, like that's gaining like 8 or 9, like that's like where most of the value came from like
Hmm.
from the count your blessings. So you're already winning if you just bring one poison the well in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think Gravekeepings has like a different but kind of similar effect, especially in a deck like New that has codexes. Like I think the Assassin's Gravekeeping could be a very real card against it, where if you just like if you Gravekeeping even just one at the start, that means like their next 8 ones all have one less life. So you've like kind of like dealt an additional 8 damage with that Gravekeeping like over the course of the game. And like it stacks. So I think if you end up banishing like 3 count your blessings early, like you just kind of brick the card in their deck for the rest of the game, or just like make it very low value. Like they can still play it. It's just not that good.
Yeah, their value becomes worse than new, which is yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, yeah. You essentially just like by banishing them early, you just essentially be like, now your deck has like 4 bricks in it, and they're like, oh, okay.
Okay, let's start talking about the Verdance. This might be a somewhat of a longer episode, so let's get right into that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the block numbers, the block values on Verdance's card pool. So there's 2 card pools for Verdance, the Earth cards and the Wizard cards. There's generics too, but we won't be covering those. So for Earth cards, there's 25 commons, counting all the red, yellow, blue. They have 3 3 blocks, 19 2 blocks, and 3 null blocks. So I think Autumn's Touch being the only 3 block and then predominantly 2 blocks. Um, there's also 10 rares, 0 3 blocks, 6 2 blocks, 1 null block, and 3 defense reactions. So that's Rootbound Carapace, which can block for, I guess, 4, 3, and 2, assuming that you can decompose for them. So that's the Earth cards. So overall, like a lot of 2 blocks in the Earth card pool, and the more Earth cards you have in the deck, the more 2 blocks you have, unless you have Autumn's Touches and Rootbound Carapace. This is sort of the takeaway from that. Do you want to talk about the Wizard card pool?
Yeah, sure. The Wizard card pool is 28 commons. We have 24 3 blocks, 3 2 blocks, and 1 no block at the commons. We have 10 rares, which is going to be 6 3 blocks, 3 2 blocks, and 4 no blocks. The 4 no blocks is basically all the sigils, right?
It's so there's a sigil of temporal manipulations, and there's 3 colors of save thought.
Oh, save the thought. That's where it is. Okay. Yeah, so the wizard cards block really well in comparison to the earth cards. I guess this is going to be a trend in Rosetta, right? Where all the elemental cards is going to be mostly or mainly 2 blocks. And the class cards, so the wizard and the runeblade cards, actually tend to block for 3 more than not.
Yes, that is generally true. So the more talent leaning you are, the worse your block values are. The more class leaning you are, the more 3 blocks there are. And I think that's one of the really interesting questions in this set. Is a lot of people have played sealed, where you kind of get to build whatever combination you want, but the interesting thing about this set is I think you can draft decks that are more talent focused and you can draft decks that are more class focused. You're probably always going to have a mix of both, but you can definitely lean one way or the other. And those decks have different strengths and different game plans. And I think figuring out how to draft the different archetypes and when to draft each archetype is going to be really important. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit this episode with Wizard and Verdance, because I think that Verdance really does have these 2 styles. Um, the notable thing for Verdance too about all these wizard 3 blocks is they're all non-attack actions. So that means your Staff of Verdant shoots if you deal arcane damage and you pitch an Earth card to it, you'll get an embodiment of Earth, and they essentially become 4 blocks, which is kind of insane. Like that's actually huge.
Yeah, but for that to happen, none of the earth cards, other than like 1 or 2, are attack actions, right? Because most of them have decompose on it, meaning that you can't actually buff most of the earth cards, except for the sigil that blocks for 2. You do need to be playing mainly wizard cards for the block, and you need to be having some earth blues to activate the staff.
Yeah, so I think there's some Verdance decks that can make very good use of this, and then there's some Verdance decks that don't. And understanding how valuable that embodiment is for your deck is pretty important. And even understanding something like If you are playing a deck that has a good mix of these, like how many Wizard 3 blocks do I have? How many have I seen? And how many cards are left in my deck? And you might have situations where you actually have quite a few of them likely coming up, or situations where you've already seen most of them and it's very low value. So I think understanding the value of that embodiment in your deck, especially relative to the cards left in it, is going to be pretty important for Verdance.
Yeah, I've had a situation earlier this week when I pitched into the staff and then like got the embodiment. I drew up my hand and I'm like, I just drew four decomposed cards. This embodiment did nothing. And then I have another turn where I'm just like, I decided not to use the staff and I drew up and I'm like, I drew all non-attack actions. I wish I had this embodiment of Earth.
Yeah, it definitely can be like that. Maybe this is kind of like a good time to segue into like the two main Verdance archetypes. And I think what you're talking about is very characteristic of the one that people are probably the most familiar with from Sealed. This is the Earth and Arcane hybrid. You have, I'd say, like roughly a 50-50 split. You can kind of skew a little one way or the other, but you're playing a good chunk of Earth cards. You're decomposing, you're playing big attacks, and you have a bunch of life gain in your deck to start pinging them. And you're sort of this like defensive attrition based deck that will often win games by fatigue, but sometimes by burning people out with Arcane. And I think in this style of deck, you play like very, very good value, but you don't have much game closing power unless people let you get them low and you can finish them with Arcane. But in this style of deck that we're talking about is the one where you're very likely to draw a bunch of Earth attacks that block. Well, regardless of whether they block two or three, there's still Earth attacks that you can't actually get value out of with the embodiments.
This is the most I guess it's the most common, right, build of Verdance I've seen so far.
I think this is the one that like is immediately obvious and probably the one that you would see at pre-release.
Then what is the other type of Verdance deck that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm gonna call it like Wizard Pile or like Mono Wizard, where you are playing almost exclusively Wizard cards. You do want, and the idea here is you're just doing a whole bunch of Arcane and using Staff of Verdant shoots to trigger your Surge over and over again because damage prevention is pretty limited. So they will be able to keep you off Surge a little bit, but especially the Earth heroes are really going to have to pick and choose because they have their Sanctuary of Arya, and then once their boots are online, they have their boots, and other than that, they can't really shut down your surges. So you get a lot of value out of Surge, and you get a lot of value out of embodiments of Earth, and those embodiments of Earth in this deck are very, very good because you can potentially draft a deck that is like almost exclusively non-attack actions, and then the embodiments are extremely, extremely powerful. This deck does, of course, want some Earth blues in it because you need to be able to get the embodiments when you pitch to your staff, ideally. But other than that, it's like mostly wizard cards, and yeah, I think the ability to draft either one of these Verdance decks is very cool, and this Wizard deck doesn't actually need to turn on its hero power at all. You probably want some life gain for the Arcane matchup still, but like really you are just focused on dealing Arcane damage, blocking well, gaining a bit of life to buffer yourself against Arcane damage, and that's kind of it. That's kind of your whole game plan.
Then do you want to start talking about the key cards for I guess for both decks, right? Let's talk about key cards for both decks. These are the cards that Verdance wants no matter what.
So we'll kind of cover like both decks, and then specifically the Earth Arcane hybrid, and then specifically the Wizard pile is sort of how we'll structure this. So for both decks, I think the key equipments that you're looking for are Helm of Lignum Vitae. This is obviously going to be better in the Earth deck that wants to decompose because you can turn its ability on to get 2 block, or you can use it to fuel your graveyard for decompose to get decompose online faster. So Helm of Lignum Vitae, very, very good. And Hold Focus, the gloves, is something that has impressed me more and more the more that I've played with it. I think just being able to turn on your Surge without pitching a card can be pretty clutch, especially on perennial Aether Blooms. But this card's also just very good in the Wizard deck because you have so much Arcane and so much Surge, and this potentially lets you get like 2 Surge effects in one turn, one with your staff, one with Hold Focus. It's a little better in the Wizard pile, but I think it's super good in what you want regardless.
Yeah, I think the floor on both of these cards are just really good no matter what. Helm being a 1 block no matter how you play it, and Hold Focus just being 1 damage no matter how you play it as well. So I think just the floor being so high on these cards just make these cards premium for Verdance.
Yeah, and I think both of them also have the potential to be worth more. The helmet with the block 2 and the hold focus with whatever surge effect you can potentially get, whether that's like go again, perennial Aether Bloom to the bottom, whatever it is. Very, very clutch.
Talking about Perennial Aether Bloom, all colors of this card is good in Verdance.
I think so. I think like red and blue are definitely better, but if you have to play some yellow, it's fine.
If you don't have any Perennial Aether Blooms, you're gonna have this issue of like people being able to just fatigue you out if they have either enough life gain, ways that they can pressure your hand somehow, then you can fatigue if you don't have any of these cards. So this is like kind of a mandatory one of minimum in your deck, right?
Yeah, and I think ideally you have a little more than that, but yeah, mandatory you kind of want one of these to be able to start looping it back. And in the late game, this is kind of Verdance's weapon. You go Staff of Verdance shoots 4, and you can just keep doing that over and over and over again. And this is one of the ways you can actually beat Florian in fatigue. I think in particular in the Earth Mirrors, if you have this card versus you don't have this card, it's going to make a huge difference. And the multiples because they have the Sanctuary of Aria available to them, and potentially the boots while grounded, which a lot of people are learning to save for perennial Aether Bloom. So that's why having multiples is really good. Maybe we can also talk about if you don't have multiples, the other way you can beat fatigue is with Save the Thought, especially red and yellow, where you can shuffle back. The red one shuffles back 3 cards and makes a ponder. It's a 2-cost instant. The yellow is 2 cards, the blue is 1 card. Save the Thought is a great way to both just get cards in deck to combat fatigue, very good fatigue strategy, but also to cycle back your perennial Aether Bloom so that if you do stop the surge, you can then get it back into your deck and then start searching it again. So this is sort of like a maybe you can only find the one perennial Aether Bloom, but maybe you find a Save the Thought, then you kind of have 2 copies, and if you can, find a way to get around one of their preventions, or maybe they don't have the well grounded, then you're kind of off to the races.
And just like being able to like shuffle 3 back is kind of nice in this format because it does tend to go to fatigue quite often.
Yeah, specifically the Earth Mirrors tend to go to fatigue. I think the Lightning heroes often don't. They can, but they don't usually. And I think this is mostly like an Earth Mirror card. But I've been seeing a lot of kind of like 5 Earth Hero pods. So you are a little more likely to play Earth Heroes than Lightning Heroes. How's it been in Vancouver since I haven't drafted there? Is it sort of similar, like 5 Earth Heroes?
Yeah, it is like 5 Earth Heroes. There was one pod I played where we had 7 Earth Heroes, 1 Lightning, I think. Or it was like
Holy.
6 and 2. There might be an Acilio, but the 1 Lightning hero was Aurora, and Aurora just like that it was unbeatable. That deck was way too good. All the Earth decks were way too bad, and they're just like 4 4 4 4 4 every turn. And we're just like, okay, yep. This is what happens when everyone tries to go Earth.
Yeah, I do think that the Lightning Heroes are pretty real. I think they're a little bit trickier to draft, and people need to learn how to figure them out. And specifically, like I think a lot of people understand how to draft the really heavy lightning decks, but how do you draft the decks when you get like some good lightning cards and then you need to rely on the class pool as well is I think the real thing to figure out about this format. I'm starting to have some ideas of this, but it's definitely something I need to explore more, and I'm actually very excited about because I do think it is possible. Is sort of my long and short of it. I don't know exactly what the decks look like. I'm still kind of like narrowing in on that, but I do think that the some lightning cards and then good class card versions of both Acilio and Aurora do exist.
Yeah, and if we can figure it out this week, then we'll have an episode next week on how to draft that Lightning Hero. If not, it'll be in 2 weeks if we can figure it out by then. So let's keep talking about our key cards, and I think the next key card would be Pulsing Aether Life, which is the meld card at rare for Verdance.
Yeah, I think all the meld cards are very good. This is no exception. A lot of we kind of talked about like most of the arcane spells being like zaps or scalding rain, so 0 for 3 or 1 for 4. Um, this being like a 2 for 5 because you get the life gain, or a 2 for 6 if you have Verdance online is just really good. Arcane damage is pretty strong in this format, and I guess like arcane damage slash life gain, they're kind of on the same axes as like not physical damage, and yeah. 2 for 6 spell is just super efficient. It's also an Earth 3 block. It's also a 1 for 4 if you want to pair it with something like Exploding Aether. I think this card just like kind of does everything you want. I'll also say that I did play against a deck at pre-release that had multiple of these and then shuffled them back with Save the Thoughts, and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna die. Like, this isn't coming down to fatigue. You're just gonna kill me.
I had a deck with two Pulsing Aether recently in draft, and there was a spot where I'm just like, no, I messed up. I have to block with this Pulsing Aether because I like stranded my arsenal. I got so sad. And then I played my second Pulsing Aether from my just like I naturally drew it and played it, and my opponent was like, "You had two in your deck, and you were complaining that you blocked with one." And I was like, "Yeah, I was."
Yeah, card is kind of insane.
I think all the numbers on this card is so good, right? Just like it
Yeah.
costing one means that you can just pitch a blue to play both sides. It blocking for 3 is great. Dealing 4 damage is. Oh man, this card's so good.
Yeah, I've been very impressed with Pulsing Aether Life. I think it's like it reads like pretty good and then it plays like crazy good. Is sort of where I'm at with this card.
Do you think this card is constructed playable?
Yeah, yeah. I think any Verdance list is playing this card. Mostly because it's like it's because it just does like enough of everything. Like it being like an Earth 3 block carries a lot of weight. I think you want some amount of spells. This is one of the better spells you can get. Something else that's cool is I've seen a lot of Verdance decks playing Plume of Evergrowth, and that's usually to buy back Rampant Growth to be able to like gain some life, double Rampant Growth, amp a bunch, and then use like Surgeon Aether Tide into spell. But one thing that's sweet is that because this is an Earth card, you can actually get back Pulsing Aether Life as well off Plume. So if you happen to draw the two Rampant Growths but no spell, you can actually still Plume for the piece that you need. So it like being able to get either half of the combo is very cool.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Okay, then let's talk about the Earth cards that are good in Verdance next. So this is gonna be basically these are gonna be like the three blocks in Earth, right? So Rootbound Carapace and Autumn Touch.
I think Rootbound Carapace is like obviously much better in the one that wants to decompose and turn on the hero power, but like you can play red Rootbound Carapace in either version of the deck and it's going to be real solid. Um, but yeah, the Earth 3 blocks are so premium because these are the only cards that block 3 in the whole Earth pool, and like you need ways to get cards into the graveyard. So ideally, some of that is like reds that you can play, but you want to avoid blocking 2 with Earth cards as much as you can. You're probably going to have to do some amount of it, but the less you have to do of it, the better.
And in the same vein, Fruits of the Forest is a key card in any color actually, and that's also because you get to like just discard it and gain 2 life, and fuel your decompose whenever you need it to. And it also is a 3 for 7 for some reason. This card is kind of overstated.
Yeah, Fruits of the Forest is like kind of crazy. They're very good threats that you can play out at any color. Gaining life to convert hands is really important, especially against people trying to do lots of arcane to you. And when Verdance is online, this is gain 2, deal 1, which is like even crazier. Like to be clear, I think this card's also premium in Florian, but Verdance making this into like making any of the pitches into like essentially like head jab, like arcane head jab or life gain / arcane head jab is like
Yeah, this Fruits has definitely impressed me. In just like no matter when you draw it, it's good. So then it's like it's good if you pitch stack it. It's good if you play it. It's good if you use its ability. Card is all around good too.
definitely agree with that. And then after that is just other life gain sources you generally want. So Harvest Season, particularly the red one, I think is really good. That's the 1 cost aura that stays on board, and then at the start of your next turn you gain 3, and it destroys itself. That one's very good. It pairs nicely with some of the 2 costs that Verdance might want to play. And then Arcane Polarity, I think, is basically just a good card in this set, especially the red one. This is the gain 1 instant, and then if you take an arcane damage, you can gain 4 instead. Honestly, like all the pitches of this card are kind of playable. I do think like red is better than yellow, is better than blue, but you can. I've had decks where I've played like one blue arcane polarity, and it's like honestly kind of fine.
Yeah, I think it's really good actually. Like Arcane Polarity in blue is like in Verdant specifically. It's kind of nice that you get to pitch it and then when you draw it in your pitch deck, you should have your Verdance ID online, and then it's just you play it as gain one, deal one, which is fine.
Yeah, and you can also get the gain two. So it's like just kind of always worth two, and it doesn't use your action point, which is just like pretty solid.
Yeah, it's you can't complain. I think is where it's at. Then do you want to move on and talk about the cards that are good in the Earth Arcane Verdance deck?
Yeah, in the Earth Arcane Verdance deck, you really want to get Decomposers. How many Decomposers do you think you want?
I think you want four red ones, or four decomposers that you want to actively play. So I think four red is like where I want to be. So then you see it early enough and often enough that it's gonna be good. And I think you end up wanting to have like six total, including like yellows or blues, is where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think if you can get that, it's nice. I think like three is like kind of on the minimum end, and then I'd say like up to six is reasonable. But yeah, I think I agree. Four red ones, if you can get it, is fine. But I think if you have like three, it's like also okay. There's also some yellows that are very good. I think maybe one of the best decomposers is Cadaverous Tilling. All the colors of this are good, honestly, because it's a 3 for 8, 7, or 6 when you decompose, which is just like super solid on rate. So Cadaverous Tilling is really, really premium. Blossoming Decay, I think, is a fair bit better in Verdance than Florian, because once Verdance is online, you get the arcane damage from the life gain. And notably, even if Blossoming Decay is the decompose that turns on Verdant, so if you have like 2 Earth cards in your banish and then you banish 2 more in Blossoming Decay with Blossoming Decay, you get the arcane damage ping because by the time the trigger resolves, you already have 4 Earth cards in your banish. So Blossoming Decay pretty solid, especially if you have Harvest Season to pair with it because Harvest Season costs 1, Blossoming Decay costs 2, so you can sort of go like 1 cost, 2 cost, and that's quite efficient. Any other decomposers you're looking for?
I think Rootbound Carapace can count as one, and it's a pretty good one to have. We already talked about it, but this is, I think, a premium decomposer. It is at rare. And talking about the rare decomposer, Summer's Fall is the other one that I'm really looking for. And it is only a 2 for 6, but if you can bottom deck an aura, it does feel really good. Like, even if it's like you bottom deck like an embodiment of Earth, it's pretty sweet. If you bottom deck a rune chant, it's pretty sweet. And I think just like being able to decompose is like something that's good in general. At this point, I'm kind of happy being able to decompose more than the ability you get from it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the decomposers are pretty premium and you need to have enough to have a good earth deck. So I think that like starting with if you're wanting to be like the earth heroes that turn on their hero ability, which I think are some of the best decks in the format, you need to have these decomposers and you need to have them early. So you kind of need to pick them highly if you're going to get them at all. And then you get a whole bunch of payoffs for that. And I think those payoffs are largely what we're looking for in this Earth Arcane deck. So probably the best one is Well Grounded. These are the Earth Boots that when you have 4 or more Earth cards in your banish, you can destroy them and prevent the next 2 damage that would be dealt to you this turn. That can be physical, that can be arcane, that can be from multiple sources. So this can stop like 4 on an attack and then 4 on another attack and stop a rune chant and 1 damage on the attack. It's good for stopping Surge. This card is maybe one of the most premium equipments in the set. I think it's just such a powerful effect, but you do need to be turning on your hero ability to be able to use it.
Yeah, yeah. If you can't turn it on, this card is really bad. But if you can turn it on, this card's really good.
Fertile Ground. This is the 2 cost instant that gains 2 life, and then the red gains 5, the blue gains 4. Sorry, the yellow gains 4, the blue gains 3 if you have your hero power online at 4. So yeah, Fertile Ground is like a pretty big payoff for having your hero ability online and is good when you're decomposing. Honestly, I think kind of all colors of this card are pretty good. It just gains so much life, and when you get the arcane damage in addition to it, it's pretty crazy. Like the red one is kind of like a 2 for 6 go again, if you think about it. And then it's like life gain and arcane is like a little premium compared to physical even.
Fertile Ground, I think, is probably like the card that went from like, this card might be good during our like pre-release, like when we're talking about all the cards like before the pre-release. Now that I've drafted this set a couple times, I feel like for now round like shot all the way up to like in my pick orders at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And it's another card that pairs well with Harvest Season. So I think that's like one of the things with Harvest Season, the one cost aura, is you need two costs to pair with it, and Fertile Ground is one of the better two costs you can pair with it. The next key card I have is just big attacks. I think like honestly, like kind of any of them are good. The red earth ones are probably preferable because they also fill your yard for decompose while not making you block two. So those are all good. But like the red 3 for 7s are really good. Even like yellow 2 for 6s are fine. Like Findle's Fighting Spirit is in this category. You just kind of want big attacks in this deck.
Yeah, anything that pressures your opponent, honestly. The problem with this deck is that it's not going to have that much go again, so you just want to have high cost, high power attacks to make sure that, your opponent wants to block, or, at least like you can rip some cards out of your opponent's hand in case they want to convert 4 cards.
The other reason you want the big attacks is that the attacks do a lot of deck damage for fatigue math, and one of your primary win cons is just fatigue, honestly. You're just saying the cards in my deck are worth more than the cards in your deck, and that's how I'm going to win. And to do that, you need to have cards that are, trading. Like every time you play a 2 for 7, you're trading for like 2 cards and a life point, assuming they have all 3 blocks, which gets you ahead in terms of like the deck damage or fatigue race. And yeah, you just need these big attacks for that.
Then the last card for this pile would be Red Zaps. So that's like any of the 0 cost for 3 damage cards if they have Surge or not.
Yeah, I think you kind of want some amount of these. They can help you close the game. They're also 3 blocks. One of the things I found about Verdance in this Earth pile is that like there's a limit to how many big attacks you can have in your deck because most of them block two. So if you end up having a deck that's just like 30 big attacks that all block two, you end up just having to block with a bunch of them, and then you're just like, but I could have blocked with 3 blocks. So I think you actually want like some number of wizard cards and not just exclusively big attacks. They do have like you draft them very highly, and I think usually you don't hit the threshold on them, but you do want a mixture of big attacks and 3 blocks.
Or unless they're all Autumn Touches.
Yeah, sure, but I don't think that's realistically going to happen. I guess if you have like mono Autumn's Touch and Decomposed deck, you're in life gain, you're like probably pretty happy, but I don't think it's too realistic.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Like the most amount of Autumn Touch I had in my deck is like 3 so far, and that's just not enough.
And like Findles is like kind of a 3 block, but that card's also contested. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard to get all those. Okay, then do you want to talk about which cards are good in the Wizard pile?
Yeah, so basically you want lots of red spells and then like blue spells as the blue 3 blocks. So they're like all pretty good, but and like they're all like pretty high picks. So any of the zaps are good. But in particular, Trailblazing Ether is really, really premium. This is the one that surges and gets Go Again and is a zap. The Go Again is very important because it potentially allows you to really punish your opponent if they can't convert their hand. You just have such easy access to Surge between Hold Focus if you drafted it, but also Staff of Verdant Shoots, that, just going like Staff of Verdant Shoots, Trailblazing Ether for 4, it gets Go Again, zap you for 3. That 7 Arcane adds up super, super, super quickly, and you can kind of strand your opponent with cards. And I think having the Go Agains is particularly important in this Arcane deck.
Typically, Wizard cards don't have Go Again, and it's very difficult to convert like 2, 3 card hands with Zaps and Molten Rain, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is very hard to convert, and this is kind of like how you get to do that. And I think one of the advantages you get, especially against the Earth heroes, is by converting your hand. Well, they like if you get to convert your hand for 7 Arcane, and like maybe you blocked 4, that's pretty good. And then so that's like 11 points, right? You block 4, you deal 7 Arcane with the Surge Go Again into a zap. And then if all they can do is throw a 3 for 7, you've actually outvalued them by 4 on that turn cycle because they're stranded with cards. So I think you get a lot of equity out of just like not letting people convert, not letting people fill their graveyard, and just making things very awkward for them. And Go Again is like a big punisher for that. It like lets you go like, okay, you can't convert. I'm left with extra cards because you didn't pressure me that much, and now I get to go even more Go Again and still not let you convert. So it can have a bit of a snowballing effect. On that note, Ether Quickening is really good as well. This is the Scalding Rain, the 1 for 4 that has Surge Go Again. Basically, all the same stuff applies. I think Ether Quickening is a little harder to use because it costs one. So you either need lots of Scalding Rains, and you can kind of go like Surge into Surge, and it's like a 4 card 8, which is like not as exciting. Or the more powerful synergy is with Exploding Ether. This is the 2 cost go again amp 3. Um, at red, I think specifically the red one is good. The yellow and blue not very good, but if you can just go like 7 go again on Aether Quickening into a zap for 3, that's like 10 arcane is crazy. You close games very, very, very fast with that combo. So I think that the Exploding Ether, you kind of want to pair them with Scalding Rains. And I would say that the way I'm thinking about it is I want Scalding Rains and Exploding Ether is like roughly 1 to 1. You can maybe have like a few more Scalding Rains because they still block 3. But yeah, roughly 1 to 1.
Anything else you want in this deck?
Earth Blues, any Earth Blues good. The non-attacks are especially good because they turn into 3 blocks. So like any of the Earth Blue non-attacks are pretty solid in this deck. Sigil probably being the best one. And then the discard amp ones are also really, really good. Sometimes you can also get stranded with cards, and just being able to discard to amp one as a way to convert is like pretty solid. So the discard amp ones are like any of the spells that discard amp one, especially the blues are good, even the reds are good. They're just pretty solid. And then Earth Form is really, really good in this deck. I think this is like the best home for Earth Form, especially the red one.
Which card is Earth Form?
Earth Form is the rare. It's a red 3 for 7, and on hit it makes an embodiment of Earth. Even though your primary plan is to play spells, you can play a few big attacks, and a big attack that makes multiple embodiments is really good. And I think in particular, this is important against a deck like Aurora, who's pretty good at converting her hands, and you'd kind of need to play more of a value game. For those decks, I think you need some big attacks, and I think Earthform in particular is just like super, super good. If you can like swing 7, block 4, block 4.
Okay, then do you want to move on to our overrated and underrated cards, at least for now?
My first overrated card is Strength of Four Seasons, red and yellow. These cards are good when they are online, but I think there's a real limit to how many you can play because when it's not online, you're just playing like a red 2 for 4 or a yellow 2 for 3, which is pretty bad. And yes, you can arsenal it, but you're often wanting to arsenal decompose cards or fertile grounds. Like basically like this competes with fertile ground, and I think there's a limit to how many of these total you can run, especially not in your blue base. The blues are fantastic because they're just second cycle 2 for 6s, which is crazy. But the reds and yellows, I think sometimes people are like, wow, I have like 3 of these, and I'm like, I don't think you want 3 of these.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah, there are lots of situations where if you, I feel like the more decompose you have, the better the red and yellow gets. So like
Mhm.
if you have like maybe like 8 or 9 decomposed cards where you can like actively have 4 earth cards in your banish by turn 2, then I feel like Strength of Four Seasons is pretty good in multiples. But I think if you don't have like a big density of decomposers, so if you only have like 3 to 4 decomposers, then this card is quite awful because what are you gonna do? Like block for 2? Like that's not where you want to be with this card.
Blue one very good though. I think the blue one's just like kind of premium.
Oh yeah, it's a 2 for 6. That's like on rate with like a red one, but you get to make 3 resources on your first cycle. That's insane.
Any other overrated cards?
I think Sigil Temporal Manipulation. I don't know if this card is like actually overrated or if like people are like just trying to pick it kind of highly and like trying to play with it. But this card in general is not a limited card, I don't think. I think this card is more for constructed or seeded more for constructed than it is for limited. Even if you play this card first cycle, let's start with that. If you play this card first cycle, you're about 50%. Let's say you have a deck that's built for sigil temporal manipulation, and your deck is like, let's say, like 70% non attack actions. In that case, yes, you're only 2/3 of the time hitting with this card, and 1/3 of the time you just burned. Like you played a card to do absolutely nothing, and then you lost a card from your deck that you can't even play now, and you're just like losing in fatigue. So like you just dealt yourself fatigue damage and did nothing with one card, which is like worst case scenario. And the best case scenario with this card is like you pitch stack it, you try and get something off of it, but then you're really only trading one card for one card. So it's like, yes, you get like the card gets pseudo go again because it becomes an instant, but I don't think it's actually that powerful, or it's not powerful enough for you to want to play it unless you have like a specific game plan to like pop off with sigil or temporal manipulation. But even then, that game plan, I feel like as young heroes with 20 life is a game plan I don't think you can really pursue in limited right.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit higher on this card than you, but I agree that it's overrated. I think that this card basically doesn't have a place in Verdance. I don't think I ever want this in my Verdance deck, even in the Wizard Pile style deck. I think Acilio has some interesting pitch deck shenanigans that he can do, and being able to like discard cards to get there faster is pretty good. But it feels more like you need the good Acilio deck that can then like incidentally pitch stack with this card, and then like this card becomes good, rather than a like I see this card and then like I can draft Acilio. I don't think this makes a bad Acilio deck good, but I think it can make a good Acilio deck very good by giving it like a late game win con.
Okay, yeah. I'm even skeptical on that because like I feel like a good Acilio deck might not even need a sigil temporal manipulation, and it might be like overkill. Like you might just be overkilling your opponent at this point.
Yeah, I think there's definitely decks that want this card, but yeah, it basically, in my opinion, it basically needs to be second cycled, and I think it's not a high priority. It's something that like you get rewarded for late in the pack for being a Cilio.
Yeah, I think like you get this card like 12th pick, and you're like pretty happy if you're a Cilia, right?
Yes, yes, I think it's much more of that style of a card where like there's spots where it can be good, but you don't need to pick it highly because most other people probably don't want this card.
Right, that's fair. And then let's move on to underrated cards. And I think number one underrated card, at least that I've found so far, is Fertile Ground. I think Fertile Ground's like mostly in yellow and blue is coming around too late, and blue Fertile Ground, it doesn't feel like it's great because you're only gaining 3 life for 2 cards, or 2 life if you don't even have the ability turned on. But just the fact that you get to pitch the blue ones like as a blue pitch to play your cards naturally is fine. Mainly the fact that so many of the wizard heroes wants to try and strand cards in your hand, being able to like, even if it's not for the great value, to convert something is pretty premium. And I've had this like experience of like earth heroes sometimes being stranded with 4 cards and having a lot of issue converting if you are playing just like attacks and like regular good cards, that sometimes just having like multiple blue fertile ground is just good enough. It also just helps that when you play this card early, it doesn't feel bad if you don't have the 4 earth cards in banish, because you're only losing out on 1 point, and you can play it in the first cycle pretty early just to turn on your decompose, which I find doing pretty often in this format.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you said. I think Fertile Ground pretty good. I think most people recognize that the reds are good, but the yellows and blues are actually also just like very solid. The other life gain card that you have down is Harvest Season, particularly the red one. I think is really really premium. It's interesting because I think in a lot of my calling drafts, this card seemed pretty contested. But have you been seeing pods where this is going late?
Yeah, I think what's happening is some people are picking yield strong yield. Sorry, I think some people are picking strong yield over harvest season. Harvest season actually is a better card than strong yield at this point. This might flip again later in the format, but at least for now, I think harvest season is just the better aura one cost with go again than strong yield. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's particularly close. Strong Yield sort of like forces you to have an attack that you can play on the next turn, whereas Harvest Season you just like always get the three. In Verdance, you also get the one Arcane out of it, which is really good. And I don't know, life gain is just. I think like a good heuristic for this set is that if it's life gain or arcane damage, it's worth a little bit more than the same amount in physical damage. It's like I don't really want to assign a number to it because I don't think it's like one value higher necessarily, but it does have a little bit of a premium. So I think that like that's like a very useful heuristic is if you're comparing like gaining 5 life to dealing 5 damage, gaining 5 life is like a little better.
Then the last card on our list or underrated is Rootbound Carapace Yellow. This card is just a decomposer that blocks for 3. That's great, right?
Yeah, I think so. You can also arsenal it, which is very good. And like this card is seeing constructed play. I think the big thing that this card does also is it lets you decompose without using your action point. But both the rootbound carapaces do, which is really, really important because sometimes your decomposes are towards the bottom of your deck, and it can be like if you needed to spend like two, like you maybe you draw your two decomposers, but you still need 2 turns to actually play them. But if you have a rootbound carapace, you can sometimes just go like, okay, I've missed the first 3 turns on my decomposes. I got a bit unlucky that my 6 decomposes are in the bottom half, but now I can just go rootbound carapace into like blossoming decay or cadaverous tilling or whatever, and my hero's online all in 1 turn, which is really, really good.
I think just being able to turn on your hero ability is going to be a premium in at least in the Earth variant of all the Earth heroes, and Rootbound Carapace Yellow just being a 3 block as well. And 3 blocks are gonna be tough to get to. At least Earth 3 blocks are gonna be tough, and Rootbound Carapace Yellow is definitely our Earth 3 block. So it should definitely be higher than what people are picking right now, I think.
Like I think this is like actually kind of like a very premium card. Like if somebody passes me this and I'm getting this like fourth pick, I'm like, oh, Earth is open is like what I'm thinking.
Yeah, yeah. Or it should be open. Sometimes they just underrate the card and then they pass it, and you're just like, huh, maybe Earth is open, and then Earth is not open because people didn't pick it.
Yeah, definitely true. All right, maybe we can talk about the deck outlines for each of these. Do you wanna lead people through the Earth Arcane deck outline, and then I can do the Wizard pile?
Yeah, sure, sure. Okay, then we'll do the Earth Arcane deck outline first. Let's talk about the blues first. We need 12 to 16 blues. The more blues is good in this deck, mostly because you're going to be playing a lot of 3 costs in this deck. So not having a blue in your hand can be pretty punishing. So you want as many blues as possible. You want I would say 3 to 6 decomposers. The more decomposers you have, the better. The faster you can turn on your decompose, the better this deck gets. And you want about 15 earth cards. So you want half your deck to be earth cards so then you can decompose. You want about 5 red zaps, and you want as many life gain cards as you can get essentially. So then once you turn on your hero ability, then you can all of your life gain cards basically gets an additional point on top from your hero ability.
Yeah, life gain very good in Verdance, and I think you kind of want like minimum 10 life gain, honestly. Otherwise, you're just gonna lose to arcane damage.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think so.
If you can, like sometimes you can't, but if you can, you probably want like 10 plus.
Yeah, I don't think you can get that many though, right?
It's like an ideal. Like I think if like basically like if I have less than 10 life gain like total, like I don't mean like 10 cards, like I mean like 10 like points of life gain in my deck, like I'm probably picking life gain over almost anything if it's like late in the draft.
Oh, like you want like 10 points of life gain, not 10 cards of life gain.
Yes, not 10 cards. Like I think you need to be able to gain like minimum 10 points of life or you have some real problems.
Okay, yeah, yeah, okay. I agree with you with that. Yeah, yeah. If you have like 3 harvest seasons and like yeah, yeah, that's like 10 life. Yeah, that makes sense. Yes, yes.
Yeah, like roughly ballpark. It's not like a perfect number. It's just sort of like a bit of a gut feeling that I have.
Yeah. The more the better, right?
Yeah, the more the better. I think that it's hard to have there is such a thing as too much life gain. I think the life gain is generally less card efficient than the attacks, and if you have a bunch of life gain and you don't have perennial Aether Blooms, you can sort of like wind up in a spot where your opponent, like especially in the Verdance Mirror, like you can actually draw them, which is not really good for you because like you can't actually win the game, but you also don't lose the game, and it's like not ideal. So there is such a thing as too much life gain, but for the most part, the more the better.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's contested enough that it's you're gonna have a hard time. You're gonna have a harder time finding the life gain cards than not. So yeah, I think as a heuristic, just more life gain equals better is a good heuristic for now, at least.
Yeah, and then a note on the 12 to 16 blues. I think that ideally you're playing a higher blue count, but some of the things that influence that is the types of blues you have. So if all your blues are just like blues, zaps, and sigils, you probably don't want 16 blues because your card quality is going to be really bad. But when you start having cards like blue Cadaverous Tilling, blue Strength of Four Seasons, these blues that attack for 5 or 6, these are blues that almost play close to reds and let you increase your blue count. So yeah, I would say like the more strong blues that you have that you can actually play and have a reasonable effect, the higher you can go on blue count. And part of the reason these cards are really important. Blue Findles is another fantastic example of this in Verdance. So I think you are looking for a higher, like closer to the 15, 16 count if you can, but you need to have some quality blues to do this. And we kind of saw the same thing in part the Mist Veil. A lot of the Mystic heroes could go high on blue count because so many of the blues were just really good.
Yeah, I think one other note about this deck is this is a deck that kind of doesn't use your staff often, right? Like the only time you're really using your staff is to turn on your Aether Blooms, and other than that, like unless you're stranded with a card, you're typically not using your staff.
Yeah, and I think you're typically not playing your arcane spells because your main win condition is fatigue. So you'd rather than play, even if you pitch a card into it and you get like a 0 for 4, you're doing like one card for 4 damage. Whereas if you're playing an attack, you're doing one card for like 6 or 7 damage in terms of like cards out of deck. And you would just rather be doing like the more like card efficient play is like kind of what you're trying to do with this hero. And the arcane damage is really only if you're going to end the game, but even that gets complicated because there's prevention and life gain. So you can like sometimes bait yourself into like, I see people do this, they like get someone kind of low and then they try to play like 5 zaps in a row and their opponent just sits there and keeps gaining life, and then it's like, oh, now I fatigue because rather than like blocking for 3 with my zaps and sending more 3 for 7s, I just was sending like 0 for 4s and like, or like I guess like 3 cost 4 arcanes, and I just lose in fatigue.
Yes, yes. It's interesting. This format is interesting. Just because your opponent's life doesn't mean they're dead. So it's kind of important to keep track of what your opponent's pitching, mostly if they're pitching something like Third Outground.
Yeah, having an idea of how much life gain is left in their deck is important.
Okay, then do you want to move on and talk about the deck outline for the wizard pile?
Yeah, so for the wizard pile, you want about 10-ish blues. I think you can even get away a little bit lower, like 8 or 9, but about 10 is good. You probably want about 5 or 6 of those to be earth blues. Autumn's Touch is great because it blocks 3 and non-attack. Any of the non-attacks are good. I think Sigil of Earth or is like also very good because it gives you an embodiment. But most of the time you're just pitching your earth blues to your staff, so you want about 5-ish earth blues. 2 blocks are fine. Like if you have to play 2 block attacks, it's fine. But yeah, I think you'd rather it be like fruits, non-attacks, and Autumn's Touches. After that, you want basically as many red zaps as you can, especially the Surge Go Again one, but any of them are honestly pretty good. You want some perennial Aether Blooms, ideally at least 2. That's across like different colors, but you want some of these so that you can have some inevitability. You want Scalding Rain red plus exploding aether reds in 1-to-1 ratio. Some decks will have more of this, some decks might not have any of this, but you want roughly a 1-to-1 ratio of the scalding rains and the exploding aethers. That's the 2 for 3 amp. As many block threes as you can, which should be easy because you're drafting mostly wizard cards, and that lets you really leverage embodiments. And then you also want some life gain. Probably not Fertile Ground because you're not turning on your hero power, but Harvest Season is reasonable. Arcane Polarity is reasonable. Yeah, you need some life gain to be able to deal with Acilio in particular and Florian. If he has a bunch of rune chants. So you don't need like, I think you don't need as much life gain in this deck as the other Verdance deck, especially because you don't get the pings later in the game, but you want a little bit at least in the sideboard so that you're able to win those matchups pretty consistently. Into Verdance, playing the life gain is like also reasonable if it's a Verdance mirror, but I think in general you actually don't need that much because it's hard for them to actually burn you out since you have like if you're drafting this deck, you just have so much more arcane than they do that it's very hard for them to realistically like burn you out with arcane.
That's fair. That's fair.
The last piece that you want is you do want some of these big attacks still. I think you probably want somewhere in the realm of like 2 to 4 of these red 3 for 7s. Ideally, they block 3 or they're Fruits of the Forest, but do what you can. Finals are fine as well. If you have to play some others, that's also okay. Earth Form's really good. But I think you need some big attacks to help deal with Aurora.
Oh, I see. That makes sense because Aurora is the one that can't block, right?
The biggest thing is that Aurora is probably the best deck at converting her hands. So you kind of need to compete on rate against Aurora, and this deck is not as good on rate because you're dealing all arcane, and she can just kind of like outvalue you. So you actually need some big attacks to kind of make up the rate, and then you can burn her out from there. Whereas like if they have a very good Aurora deck and they're just like converting 13 to 14 every turn, and you're just like blocking and zapping them, like you're not really winning.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
I think a good Aurora deck is like the biggest weakness of this deck, but I think this deck's very good into the Earth Heroes, basically.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Then, do you want to close out the episode with the matchups? How do you want to go along with this matchups? Because I feel like the two different Verdance decks kind of play differently depending on which deck you have, right? Against each hero.
Yeah, I think we can cover each of them just very briefly.
Sure. Then, which do you want to do? Like the matchups for one deck first, and then the next deck, or do you want to do like hero both decks?
Sure, let's do one deck then the other deck. We've been doing Earth Arcane first, and I think that's the one people are most familiar with. So maybe we can run through the matchups for each hero with the Earth Arcane deck, and then with the Wizard file afterwards.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about the Verdance Mirror first.
Yeah, so in the Verdance Mirror with the Earth deck, I think you're trying to get the most value out of each card in your deck. You don't want to go too low because you can just die to arcane damage, but if you know you have life gain, you can afford to go a little bit lower. Sometimes this means like pitching some reds to the bottom if you have enough life to work with and conserving them in deck rather than blocking with them, especially if it's like a red 3 for 7 that blocks 2. You'd much rather play it than block with it. That's kind of what we mean by maximizing the value of each card. And these games are often won through fatigue, but there is sort of the arcane damage win con as well if people get too low.
Yes, yes. And it's actually kind of funny where I think in the mirror, you kind of want to bait your opponent into trying to finish you with some arcane damage and then trying to gain 10 life to be like, oh, actually, I'm not at 3, I'm at 13. And then you kind of like force them to make plays that are not efficient, and then you can out fatigue them. And I feel like that's like a really good way of like winning that matchup. The only problem is like you get yourself kind of low, and then you don't draw the life gain, and then you just lose. Is like the downside of doing this kind of strategy. But if you arsenal fertile ground, so then you can do this kind of thing is kind of a tricky way you can get back in cards if you are currently behind.
Yeah, if you know you're losing on fatigue, sometimes the arcane angle can be a real win con. And if your deck has a lot of arcane, I think is like another consideration. Like if you're playing an earth deck with like a above average amount of arcane, maybe you have like a sneaky like exploding ether and scalding rain in there. You can sometimes just kind of get people. I lost a mirror in the pre-release where we're both playing the arcane version against Peter, Kano player, and he just yeah, like I got kind of low and I'm like, I got a bunch of life gain, go to 13. And then he's just like 6 arcane, 7 arcane, 5 arcane. And I'm like, oh, I'm dead. Like, this is not good.
Yeah, yeah. If their deck is really good at doing arcane, then yeah, you will just die to it.
Yeah, I wasn't really expecting there to be like quite that much, but it was just like, oh, I'm super, super dead. Got it. Do you want to talk about Florian next?
Yeah, let's talk about Florian. So yeah, I think we keep on saying this. The Earth mirrors typically go to fatigue. So same as Verdance, you do need to maximize each of your cards, and this is this is the matchup where you need to prioritize Aether Perennial Aether Bloom. And if you don't loop this, then Florian has a weapon, so they will out fatigue you at the very late game when you both players only have blues left in the deck. Florian is just like much better at converting the blues, just because like most of their blues are gonna be auras that they get to play, and then they're gonna swing their sword at you for 4, where you just don't have a weapon, and if you don't have a Aether Bloom, you are gonna fatigue out first.
Yeah. I think that Florian is like kind of a tricky matchup for Verdance, and you need to play it very, very precisely, or you will hit fatigue. I think it's like much easier for the Florian to fatigue you than it is for Verdance to fatigue. I don't think that necessarily means that like Verdance is unfavored, so much as just like I think the gameplay patterns for Verdance are a little harder.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a mistake from Verdance will lose her the game, but a mistake from Florian will not lose him the game.
Yes, yes, that's a good way to put it. You can also just kill them with Arcane, but I think that most of the time that is not going to happen.
Yeah, I think Florian is gonna be pretty wary about the arcane damage, and they should be blocking a little bit more aggressively, and they're just gonna be better at converting two card hands anyways. So, um, yeah, I think Florian's side should be blocking more, and if they aren't, then you should be winning the game.
Yeah, the other thing about Arcane that is a little bit scary against Florian is that a lot of the Runeblade cards actually can get go again, like Rune Rager Swarm. If they have like Arcane Deadwood Dirge and Arcane Cussing combo, they actually do have ways to use big hands. And if you just like try to get cute and like zap them for 4, and then they're just like, oh, Florian's online, I have a 4 card hand and I convert all of it, you're just like, you kind of just die for it.
Yeah, I've had an opponent go arcane cussing Deadward Dirge meet and greet, and I'm just like, oh, I'm losing this game.
Yeah. So I think you actually do want to keep pressuring him with like the value plays, and yeah, don't give them too much space, because sometimes if you're like, show me you can convert, and they're like, okay, I can convert, you're pretty sad.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Against Aurora, I feel like Aurora is a pretty easy matchup to navigate. You just need to block well and convert each hand as much as you can. This is a matchup you're not gonna get to fatigue, so it's gonna be like a value race or like a value math. And as we said about Florian being able to convert, Aurora really can convert. So I typically almost never play my zaps against Aurora unless I have to.
Yeah, you're pretty much blocking with them and then sending sevens, and then maybe you can like zap to close out the game. You do need to be making proactive plays, because if all you do is sit there and block, she has a recurable weapon. She can sometimes present multiple like 5 and 6 power attacks. You're going to be the one that fatigues if all you do is block. So you cannot just sit there and block her out. You kind of have to play value with her.
Yeah, if you are playing just like the decomposed earth pile, so many of your earth cards are 2 blocks anyways, and you don't want to block with them, so you will end up playing. If you just play a natural game of flesh and blood, I think that's the way that the Aurora matchup tend to play out. I think the most important thing about Aurora is you want to block some of the earlier cards in the chain link, and fully block them out, and this will be just to snuff out their second strikes, which gets +1 and go again if you have been dealt damage. Sometimes you can't like prevent it, then you just have to like give up on it. But if you can and they want to convert 5 cards, there's a high chance that second strike is one of them. So you do want to block out the earlier chain and make them work for it more than give it to them for free.
Yeah, don't waste value to do it, but if you're able to do so reasonably, it's like fine. And that includes like sometimes, like especially if they have a big hand, like Jay mentioned, if you can like commit well grounded to cover up like 2 breakpoints of 4 and use like a 2 block on their sword, like that can actually kind of slow them down quite a bit. I've definitely stranded people with second strike where they're like, oh, I was hoping you would take one somewhere, and it's like, nope, not gonna take one.
Yeah, yeah. It's the hands that second strike convert and the hands that second strike doesn't convert is like a pretty big swing for Aurora. And sometimes you can't prevent it, and that's fine too. Aurora gets to do the thing that she wants to do sometimes.
So next we can talk about Acilio. I think Acilio has the same thing with Aurora, where you're trying to play a value game, you're trying to block in the chain early because of second strike, but also because he can suddenly just go, okay, now I'm just going to do arcane damage, you don't get a block more. So sometimes, especially if you're wanting to fill with earth cards, it can actually be worth overblocking a little bit. There's been games where I wish I had blocked with the helmet for 0 value earlier in the chain just to get decompose online sooner. Like especially if I know I have the decompose card in hand, because then they just like tricked me and did a bunch of arcane, and then they just only did arcane for the rest of the game, and I'm like, huh, this helmet never actually did anything. So don't be too conservative with your helmet. I don't think you're trying to get too value out of it. I think you're actually trying to turbo to your decompose with your helmet, and you want to get your block value whenever you can. Sometimes even if that means like if you're wasting a point, 1 point over blocking versus getting like one additional point on the next turn, sometimes it can be worth just over blocking.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And this is a matchup where if you don't use your headpiece early, they may never give you a chance to use your headpiece ever again. I've seen multiple games go in this spot of like, oh, like you lost by exactly one, and then the Verdance just has the headpiece still on and be like, "Oh, you didn't block with this?" And they're like, "Nah, just never had the chance to because I saved it for one turn." Where they could have actually got the 1 point of value from the headpiece.
I definitely agree with that. And then I think your life gain is really, really important. You kind of win this game by just like outlasting them. Like you keep gaining life and stay out of their range and throw a big attack each turn and just like hopefully they fall apart. They only have 18 life. They don't block very well. That's kind of your road to victory, and you just need to not get run over. So yeah, preserve your life total, gain some life, don't be afraid to block if you really really have to, and like wait for an off turn because they will often have some like good Acilio decks will have some very high ceiling turns and then some like kind of the deck can often stumble, so it's okay to just like don't give up a ton of value, but like if your hand blocks pretty well, it's okay to primarily block with your hand. I think in this matchup.
Yeah, yeah. I've played against a bunch of Cilios where I'm like I feel like I was losing and I was just like blocking and keeping my life total high and then like out of nowhere they just go pass and you're like, "Wait, what? You do nothing?" And you're just like, "Huh, I guess I attack you for 7." And then their hand is just so bad that like, it also just doesn't block either.
Yeah, I don't know if I've quite had Acilio's brick that hard, but I've definitely had them like be like, you like block out, it goes to their turn, you're under it a bunch of pressure, you're behind, and they're just like flittering charge for 4, and you're like, okay, I block. And they go, okay, pass. And you're like, wait, what about the instant? They're like, I just don't have it. I have a bunch of like lightning cards that don't actually have go again here. And you're just like, oh, okay, cool. Or lightning surge from hand 4, and you're just like, I see.
Yeah, Acilio has at least like if there's like a 3 Acilio pod or something like that, where there's like too many Acilios, you're gonna have a lot of those games where Acilio is gonna brick more often than not. As actually, like it'll kind of happen once a game, so you're kind of looking for those spots to be able to convert your hand.
I think I would note about this matchup is if your deck has ways to convert hands, like you want to do a lot of blocking, but having ways to convert hands without blocking, like in spots where you're just not allowed to, maybe they deal all arcane, is going to make your matchup a lot better. So this is where like your blue fertile ground could come in, where like maybe they just do 7 arcane to you that turn. If you can like swing 7 and gain 2, that little bit of extra value from playing your blue fertile ground off of 2 cards while it's not good gives you a lot of equity in the matchup and adds up over the course of multiple turns.
Yes, yes, and being able to play the blue fertile ground means you got to decompose as well, so extra bit there too. Okay.
Okay.
Then what about if we were to think about the wizard pile version of Verdance? How does that change the matchups here?
Yeah, so I can kind of cover both the Earth heroes at once because I think that they're actually very, very similar. You are basically just presenting constant arcane damage. You don't want to attack them because they want to have graveyard fill, and you basically just block very, very efficiently in them with your embodiments and then just deal lots of arcane that they can't deal with. And if they stumble on converting their hands, even like a little bit, you pull really, really far ahead. I think this deck is kind of insane in the Earth Mirrors because I'll put it this way: I almost beat a deck that had Germinate in it, and like, though I think the only reason I didn't lose to the Germinate deck is because they had 2 red vantage points and killed me with like Overpower and a bunch of Rune Chants, and I was like, if you didn't have like exactly like all this evasive damage, I actually probably still win this game through Germinate, which is like insane.
I see. Vantage point card.
Yeah, the key here is just that, like, especially if you have the go agains, like if you have the very strong version of this deck, you can just deal a whole bunch of evasive damage, and then they're just like sitting there and they're like, my decompose isn't online. Here's an autumn's touch, and you're like, okay, I have an embodiment. Block 4, take 3. Here's 7 more arcane, and they're just like, yeah, this is not good for me. And like, I've killed people before they even get their hero power online with this deck quite a few times.
That's fair. That's fair. Then what about the lightning heroes then?
The Acilio matchup I think is interesting. You're kind of like both dealing arcane damage. If you have life gain, I think you're actually pretty good here. The 4 blocks line up very good into their lightning cards, and you can kind of just like burn them down and leverage your higher life total. I think the Acilio matchup's like pretty close. You're both like able to strand each other with cards. You're both able to like deal a bunch of arcane and burst each other down. You're kind of like in some ways playing a somewhat similar game. He's a little bit more aggressive, you're a little bit more defensive is like maybe the biggest difference, and you can still kind of do the outlast thing provided that you have the life gain in your deck. Notably, be very careful against the lightning heroes because they have Twinkle Toes as well as Trip the Light Fantastic as extra prevention effects. So you can't always rely on getting the surge, and you want to just make sure you're not putting yourself in a spot where like you take damage to go like surge go again into zap, and then if they block the surge go again, you just like IP yourself. You want to make sure you're like your arsenal's open so that if they do have the prevention, you can arsenal that card and you're not just like down a whole card, for example. So I think that's very important into both Basilio as well as Aurora.
Okay, that makes sense. Then what about Aurora specifically? You talked about Acilio being kind of like a wizard mirror, but Aurora is the one that's not really doing arcane, right? I think in this format, Aurora is like the one hero that might not even make rune chance, is what I've been feeling so far. Like the really good like lightning Aurora decks don't even make rune chance, is what I feel like.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think some versions of Aurora make some rune chance, but they're often not dealing that much arcane. This matchup is a little bit tricky. I think that you need to you do block very well with your embodiments. You want some big attacks. Earth form is like one of the best cards in this matchup. Just being able to send like a 2 card 7 that then gives you a bunch of 4 blocks is like a huge beating for that matchup. But I do think you need some amount of big attacks, and then you get them a little bit low and you can try and burn them out. I think if their deck's very, very, very good, you kind of need them to stumble because it's a little bit hard to keep up on rate. And if they just like I don't think that this deck can beat an Aurora deck that converts for like 14 damage on offense every turn. Although I also think that that deck is just like very good in general.
Yeah, I think an Aurora deck that just converts 14 damage every turn is like a 3-0 Aurora deck, right? Like
Hmm.
it's coming close to like the constructed level of efficiency.
Yeah, yeah. I think that those decks are really, really impressive. But I think that if the Aurora deck is a little bit less refined and you can just like play good defense, keep poking, and then find an opportunity to like burn them down, that's very good. And your embodiments do actually do a ton of work in this matchup. Yeah, I think hold focus is also really important here. As it's important in all the matchups, but hold focus is especially good into Aurora because sometimes you're like more constrained on cards because she has so much pressure that being able to like enable surge without having to pitch a whole card to it in a key spot can be very clutch. So I think that card's like good in general, but very good into Aurora.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's kind of the matchups for Verdance with both styles of decks. I do have a last question for you that isn't in our notes, but I realize we should cover. We can start with the Earth version. What do you think about first or second as the Earth Verdance deck?
I was actually gonna ask this question too after the matchups. I'm actually not exactly sure if I want to go first or second in any matchups so far, and I think it's very deck dependent if you want to be first or second. And what's really important about going first and second in this format, at least from my just like personal takes, is it really depends on if you want to keep your Sanctuary of Aria for later in the game or if you like don't mind using it on turn one. And the more I want to use my Sanctuary of Aria on turn one, I want my opponent to go first. And the more that I want to keep my Sanctuary of Aria to use it later in the game, I want to go first. Is how it feels like for this format particularly. What do you think about this?
I think I agree with that. I think because of that, you usually want to go first into Acilio in particular, because I think Acilio really wants to get your Sanctuary of Aria. He's so good at doing arcane. His surge effects are very, very, very powerful, and if he can just present like 5, 6 arcane turn zero, and you like have the Sanctuary of Aria, that feels like a huge win for him. So I think that you actually actively want to go first against Acilio. Aurora is really weird. There's Aurora decks where if they go first and they get to like play their embodiment, get their embodiment of lightning, they're like super happy because they're just like, my deck doesn't work unless I have an embodiment of lightning. And you're just like, dang, I sure did let you just like set up, and then you just keep rolling an embodiment from turn to turn for the rest of the game, and you're like pretty happy. But I've also played against Aurora decks. Like this happened at the calling. I put the Aurora second. I'm like, maybe their deck's not that good, and they're just. I think I was on Acilio, but same idea. And they're just like, here's 13 damage and an embodiment of lightning. I'm like, oh, I'm not winning this game. Like it's already over.
Immediately lose. I see.
Yeah. So Aurora's like a really tricky one. I think maybe you're supposed to just go second into Aurora. That's sort of my gut.
Yeah, I think exactly against Aurora, I'd almost always want to go second, just because Aurora going second and then being able to convert 4 cards means you lose the game. Because all the other heroes are kind of bad at converting 4 cards, right? Like they're not exactly amazing at converting every 4 card hand, mostly like a blind four. So I think Aurora is one of the only heroes that can consistently convert 4 cards at a blind four.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. But it's weird because there's Aurora decks that want to go first, I think, but you don't know which one they are when you're sitting down across from them. So I think maybe you're supposed to go second.
Yeah. I think so. I think so. And I think that might be a big reason why in this format going second feels a little bit worse is because like it's so much harder to convert a blind four in this format than other formats. There's just like a little bit less go again in this format, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's super, super true and a good observation. And I think that honestly, in a lot of matchups, first second doesn't matter. I will say that if you're Verdance and you're in an Earth mirror and you know that you have like a perennial Aether Bloom and you really have like you're like limited on perennial Aether Blooms and that's going to be really important to your win condition. Going first is pretty good because you either get a huge chunk of damage for free, or you like if you draw an arcane spell, or you get their sanctuary, which feels like a big win. So if you are relying on sanctuary or on perennial Aether Bloom loops and you don't have that many copies of the card, going first is like I'm pretty certain is better in the Earth Mirrors.
Yeah, I think also that going first typically lets you win or be slightly ahead in the fatigue math usually. So just being able to go first and just like make your opponent block, even if it's like attacking for a 7, is is something that I consider doing, at least if I think they can't convert their hands, even if they sculpt their hand a little bit better.
Yep, I agree. And even if you fuel decomposer, the more that you're convinced the game's going to be about fatigue, the more you want to go first.
Yes. And if you think the other opponent has a lot of decomposed cards, not attacking is also reasonable because fueling their decompose first is not great. So yeah, it's there's a lot to think about going first and second in this game, and like how you think the draft has been going is like kind of important, and like being aware of like, oh, hmm, a lot of decomposed cards are missing in these like early packs, so the players on my right side probably have a lot of decomposed cards, and then if you pair against them, you probably don't want to attack them turn one because they're going to decompose you on turn one. Is something that's like an edge you can gain in this format of being like aware of who's actually to your right and like what kinds of cards are missing and what kind of deck they're on is going to be very important to just like have a general idea of. Is it will get you a lot of percentage points mostly at like high tier events at like the PT and stuff like that. And like, or if you're like getting past a lot of decomposed cards, they're probably not going to decompose you on turn one of the game, so you can probably try and fatigue them early.
I think I agree with everything you said there. We can touch on matchups for the wizard pile. I think it's also fairly straightforward. I think the wizard pile likes to go first maybe in every matchup. You just have so much arcane. Your surge effects are pretty important. If you get Sanctuary out of the way early, it feels like a pretty big win. Like if a Earth hero just like blows their Sanctuary early because you're presenting like 5 arcane, like maybe you have some of the discard amp ones and you're just like 5. If you chunk them for 5, that's great for you. And if you blow their Sanctuary, then you can just get all your go agains for the rest of the game for free until their boots are online, if they even have them. That's like actually really, really big. So I think you just want to go first into the Earth Heroes. I think into Acilio, you also want to go first. You're both dealing evasive damage. So very good. Getting the Sanctuary, very good. Just like having your surge effects be reliable is really powerful. Into Aurora, I'm a little bit less sure. I still suspect you may want to go first though for 2 reasons. The first one is that like they're often a little bit trim on blues, so that even if you go for arcane and get an embodiment, even if they sanctuary you, you often will get a damage through and still get the embodiment, especially if you can like discard amp one to bump it up to 5, which you can actually do in reactions if you want to. Like if they sanctuary, you can then like amp afterwards. That is like pretty powerful, and starting with an embodiment on board really does shift things when your deck is like primarily 4 blocks with embodiments. I also think that the more exploding ethers that you have in your deck, the more likely you are to want to go first, because 7 damage on the first turn is like not fair.
It really is not fair. My opponent did exploding Aether me on turn 1 before, and then I'm just like, oh, great. I drew 4 blues, prevent 6. And they're just like, no, that's not fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because like sometimes Sanctuary of Aria, you look at your hand and you're like, I can activate Sanctuary of Aria 4 times on turn 1. They came after me for 7. I'm losing this game. And then sometimes you look at your hand and you're like all blues and you're like, oh man, I'm please hit me for 6. And I'm like, oh wow, they came at me for 7. Okay, I guess I leak 1, but this is like the best the Sanctuary of Aria will do the whole game, and I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Interestingly, I think that this deck is just like kind of happy to always get Sanctuary out of the way, because it just gives them so much less prevention, and it gives you less that you have to worry about when you're trying to do your surge effects. You just get so much value out of surge over the course of the game that like being like, yep, you can't do anything about it is like really powerful. So I think like even in that spot where they like pitch and you deal 1, it's like, yeah, you would have hoped to deal more, but like you're still kind of okay with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, it's surprising how good and how Sanctuary of Aria is actually warping wanting to go first and second in this format is kind of interesting.
Yeah, because Helios and Uprising was like super mid outside of like turn 0 and just like emergency against Icelander. Those are kind of like the main spots for that card. But in this format, like Sanctuary is like super super deep. I think Surge is like a big part of that. Honestly, it's just like quite a bit of value you get by like gaining action points, or Acilio going open the floodgates, draw 2. That deck's pretty sweet. We can talk about that at some point. But yeah, there's some very good surge effects in the format. Pop the bubble, kill an aura. That's pretty good too.
Yeah, yeah, lots to think about with Sanctuary of Aria, and like being pitch stack tracking is kind of important in this format is what I've been feeling is, and it's also because it goes with fatigue so often. But yeah, like keep making sure you're playing your pitch stacks properly is gonna be important. This is a good format for like testing your in-game play. I think this is a really good format for like for testing each player's like ability to play the game, and like you know it, like every portion of the game in this format is going to be so important, and this is a good format. What do you think right now?
I'm pretty sure. I was a little bit not sure how I felt about the format overall after playing a bunch of sealed, and then after having a few more drafts under my belt and learning about things like the mono wizard deck, I think that this is my favorite draft format of any Flesh and Blood set, and I think it's like actually by a pretty big margin. I know that I was like high on Mistveil, but I actually think that this kind of blows Mistveil out of the water for me. I think that it's very cool that you have like I think in all of the heroes like decks that can look vastly different and want super different cards, and that the relative value of the cards changes based on what you're drafting is like something we haven't really seen that much in Flesh and Blood, but this set kind of has in spades. And I also think that the gameplay is extremely deep as well. So having like both a super deep draft portion as well as a super deep gameplay portion, as well as just like, I think if you want to, I think for newer players or players that like, don't have as many reps in limited, you can also just draft the Earth Heroes. And I think that there's like a very approachable endpoint to this format as well, that it's also pretty powerful. And I think that like having all of those things is just, yeah, I'm pretty impressed with this format.
Yeah, I'm still not there if I'm gonna put this set over Misspell. I feel like I really enjoyed the draft portion of Misspell a lot, and this format I'm not exactly there yet. But we're only week what 2, week 1. Yeah, it's only week 1 since the set came out. Technically, it came out on the 20th. We're recording on the 26th, so yeah, it's still the first week of the set technically. Yeah, it's a little too early for me to say.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I've drafted a little more this set just because of the world premiere and the calling. But it wasn't until about like maybe my 10th draft or so that I started to really feel this way. I had some reservations about this set, and then around draft 10, I was like, okay, this format's sweet. It's sort of where I'm at.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. It's actually kind of crazy that you've done 10 drafts already of this format.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't even been drafting that much the last week, which is like kind of wild. I just like ended up doing, I think, like 6 drafts over the calling weekend between practice and the 2 calling drafts. And then, a little bit of draft here and there. Did 1 or 2 online on Runaways, did one in an armory. So
Yeah, because I think I'm doing a draft tonight, and that's gonna be my draft number 4 or 5. And I feel like I drafted a bunch of this set already too. It's a good time. It's a good time to be playing Flesh and Blood, mostly limited.
yeah, yeah, I agree. I think Flesh and Blood's in a great spot right now. Pretty excited.
Okay. Do you want to close out the episode then?
Yeah, so thank you all for listening. Bit of a longer episode. I think that this may be. We'll try and keep the episodes concise, but this may end up being a little bit of a trend in this set just because there are multiple archetypes for the heroes, so it ends up being more to cover. We can also maybe look at restructuring and doing like one archetype and then the other archetype and stretching it out a little bit more, but then it won't come out for Worlds. So if listeners have particularly strong feelings about the format, please let us know. And if you want to let us know, you can do that either on Twitter. I'm at Yuki Bender. Jay is at Ueda J. Or you can message us on the Patreon Discord or through email at onthebobble at gmail.com. So get in touch with us through any of those avenues. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you all for listening. And if you have thoughts about whether covering all the archetypes in one episode is better or dividing it up so that we do like one archetype one episode, then the other archetype the other episode, we can also do that instead. So let us know what you think. Yeah, that's going to be all. Good luck at your PQs. Hope you're having fun drafting Rosetta.